Welcome back to my YouTube channel. All right, so as we were talking about, you should know that the National Voter Registration Act of 1993 was meant to increase voter turnout, but really it just increased voter registration. All right, so we're going to talk about our next case. Is on page 14. Again, if you need to pause the video, feel free to do so that everyone can read. All right, so this case, Shaw versus Reno, is from 1993, and it's actually from North Carolina. So this is a North Carolina case that went all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court. All right, so the U.S. Attorney General at the time was Janet Reno. So whenever a state redraws their congressional districts, they have to submit them to the U.S. Attorney General, and they have to be accepted by that individual to make sure that they're approved and that they're following all of the laws regarding districting, making sure that they're of equal population, things like that. So we redrew our districts in 1990. We submitted the plan to Janet Reno. Janet Reno, the Attorney General, rejected our districts and said that we had only created one black majority district. And that was not enough to adequately represent the individuals living in the state of North Carolina. So North Carolina redrew the districts a second time and gave that plan to Janet Reno. We now had two black majority districts. This would increase the likelihood that African Americans would be elected to Congress. However, the second district that they drew followed I-85 in North Carolina from about Greensboro through Winston-Salem, High Point, and then it went down towards Charlotte. And so along that road, the district itself was only as wide as I-85. And so there were 5 North Carolina residents who looked at these maps. One of them was named Shaw, who lived in this district, and he said that the district was drawn unusually on purpose, and therefore its only purpose was to secure the election of additional black representatives, and that disenfranchised him because the district was not drawn to encourage adequate representation of North Carolinians, but instead to use the drawing of maps as a way to intentionally increase black representation in Congress. The district court ruled that they failed to state a constitutional claim, so they appealed to the Supreme Court, they being the residents of North Carolina. So they sued the Janet Reno, the U.S. Attorney General, saying that the way North Carolina drew the districts was unacceptable. And so the courts have to decide if, in fact, the districts are acceptable. So the constitutional question in this case is, does a state-created, racially gerrymandered district raise a valid constitutional issue under the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause? So there was a law passed in 1988, a little bit of background on this, that was an amendment to the Voting Rights Act that said states could draw districts based on race if the goal of that district was to increase representation of black and brown people who were underrepresented in Congress. So Congress passed a law that gave states permission to racially gerrymander if the goal of the gerrymandering was to increase minority representation in Congress. So the question is, if a state does that violate the 14th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution? So the plaintiffs in the case argued that a North Carolina congressional district was so bizarrely shaped that it amounted to a racial gerrymander, which they claim violated the Equal Protection Clause. That if North Carolina was drawing districts solely based on race, that would violate the equal protection of other race groups in North Carolina. If you look at the map on the screen, District 1 is the larger district. Of course, they're going to have about the same amount of people, but that district was a majority-minority district, meaning a majority of the people that lived there were of a minority race. That was not the district necessarily in question, but District 12 was what the plaintiff saw as a worse violation, because as you can see, as that map, or as that district goes down towards the west and south, towards Charlotte, that it's only as wide as the highway was. Literally, this district just went in and scooped up inner cities of some of the larger cities in North Carolina. And so the plaintiffs in this case are arguing that that was drawn that way specifically based on race, and that gerrymandering a district based on race is a violation of the Constitution. So now let's see what the court decided. In a majority opinion, and this was a 5-4 decision, so that means it was very close, the court said that the North Carolina district resembled the most egregious racial gerrymanders of the past. The court struck down the districts on the basis that it reflected the incorrect belief that members of minority groups in different geographic areas, such as Durham versus Charlotte, had the same interest and did not have independent local needs that would be better served by having a more locally oriented representative. So the Supreme Court said that North Carolina had incorrectly assumed that a black person in Durham was exactly like a black person in Charlotte. Instead, what the court believed was that a black person in Durham probably had similar interests to other people that lived in Durham, regardless of their race, more so than they may have had in common with a black person that lived in Charlotte. And so if we're drawing the districts solely based on a person's skin color, then that is not as, then that puts more emphasis on race than it does on local interest and things that people have in common. And so they struck down our maps and said that we cannot draw districts based on race, even if the goal is to increase the number of non-white people in Congress. The dissenting opinion said that the state's gerrymandering helped a group of voters that had been historically underrepresented. So because these districts were drawn with good intentions to try to increase diversity in Congress, that they saw that the state had a good reason for drawing the districts this way. They said that people of the same skin color do share similar interests. So even if a person lives in Durham and Charlotte and they're both African Americans, then they may have similar interests, more so than their white counterparts in their same cities. They said that racial gerrymandering only goes against the Equal Protection Clause of the Constitution if the gerrymandering was meant to guarantee more power to people who already had power. So if districts were drawn to disenfranchise black people, then that would violate the Constitution. But if these districts were drawn to help black people who were historically underrepresented, then it is not a violation of the Equal Protection Clause. But the majority opinion was that the districts were illegal, so the districts were thrown out. So the impact of this case is that the court said that the deliberate segregation of voters into separate districts on the basis of race violated their constitutional right to participate in a colorblind electoral process. To be clear, gerrymandering is still a legal nightmare, but this case established that drawing districts solely based on the race of the people that live in that district, even if you have good intentions, is unconstitutional. So you cannot draw districts based on the skin color of the people that live in that district. All right, so here is a map of our current districts. Again, these have been ruled to be unconstitutional and have to be redrawn. 50.3% of North Carolina's residents voted Republican, but 10 out of 13 of our seats are Republican. So a little over a majority of North Carolinians voted for Republicans to go to the U.S. Congress, the House of Representatives, but 77% of our representatives are Republican through the use of gerrymandering. So the question before the court is partisan gerrymandering allowed if it drastically distorts partisan representation? And just an update, current events within, this semester, North Carolina courts, not federal courts, but North Carolina courts have said that partisan gerrymandering is illegal and cannot be done. And so we have redrawn our districts for the North Carolina House of Representatives and the North Carolina Senate, and these districts for U.S. Congress will also have to be redrawn this year. All right, the last case that we're going to talk about on page 15 is a pretty recent case. It's Shelby County versus Holder. This case is from 2013. Again, if you need to pause it for people to read and write, please do so. I'm going to talk pretty fast, but you have the ability to pause me and make me be quiet. So do that if you need to. All right, so a little bit of background. The Voting Rights Act of 1965, as I told you guys earlier, included provisions that required states with a history of discriminatory practices like literacy tests, poll taxes, grandfather clauses, additional registration requirements for African Americans. If those areas wanted to make any changes to the voting laws and practices that they used regarding registration and then actual voting, that the changes they proposed have to be reviewed and then approved by the U.S. Department of Justice. So basically, these counties in the South were put on probation. And if they wanted to make any changes to how they vote or how they allow people to register and how they allow people to vote, then the Department of Justice is going to have to review that before it can go into place to try to prevent additional discriminatory practices. So in 2013, Shelby County, Alabama, their elected officials sued the U.S. Department of Justice. Eric Holder was the Attorney General at the time, so that's why the case is called Shelby County versus Holder. Shelby County's officials sued the federal government, saying that they should no longer have to have their choices or their changes in their registration and election processes regulated by the federal government. Basically, their argument was, we've proved to you over 50 plus years that we are no longer using discriminatory practices. We shouldn't be on probation anymore. The federal government should not review the changes that we want to make when we want to make them. Shelby County lost at both the U.S. District Court and the Court of Appeals. In both of those courts, the judges believed that there were still racial issues in the county that required federal oversight. So they're going to appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court. The U.S. Supreme Court, the question before them was, does the renewal of Section 5 of the Voter Rights Act under the constraints of Section 4B, da-de-da-de-da. Basically, should Shelby County and other counties like it still be under the federal jurisdiction if they want to make changes to their voting practices? So to make the decision in this case, the court is going to look at the 10th Amendment and the 4th Article of the Constitution, both of which lay out the rights of state governments. So the opinion in this case, the majority opinion, it was a 5-4 decision along ideological lines. The court ruled that since the racial disparities that caused the need for the Voting Rights Act in 1965 no longer exist, that those provisions were unconstitutional. So basically, the majority said, since Shelby County, Alabama, and other counties like it in the South are no longer racist, then they no longer have to be on probation and oversight under the federal government Department of Justice. In the dissenting opinion, there is a quote from Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who did dissent. It was a pretty witty opinion or witty comment. She said that throwing out preclearance when it has worked, that's the federal oversight, throwing out the federal oversight when it has worked and is continuing to work to stop discriminatory changes to the voting practices is like throwing away your umbrella in a rainstorm because you are not getting wet. So in their opinion, the racism in the South when it comes to voting registration and voting practices had decreased because of the federal oversight, and that doing away with the federal oversight would allow discriminatory practices to return to the South. So here are some quotes from the Brennan Center. Brennan was a former Supreme Court justice about the decision in Shelby County versus Holder. They said the decision in Shelby County opened the floodgates to laws restricting voting throughout the United States. The effects were immediate. Within 24 hours of the ruling in Shelby County versus Holder, Texas announced that it would implement a strict photo ID law. 2 other states, Mississippi and Alabama, also began to enforce photo ID laws that had previously been barred because of federal preclearance. The Brennan Center for Justice has consistently found that states previously covered by the preclearance requirement have engaged in recent and significant efforts to disenfranchise voters. A 2018 Brennan Center report concluded that previously covered states have purged voters off their rolls at a significantly higher rate than non-covered jurisdictions. Our 2018 State of Voting report found that previously covered states have enacted a series of laws and other measures that restrict voting since Shelby County ended preclearance. Less than 2 months after Shelby County, North Carolina enacted a far-reaching and pernicious voting bill. House Bill 589 instituted a strict photo ID requirement, curtailed early voting, eliminated same-day registration, restricted pre-registration, ended annual voter registration drives, and eliminated the authority of county boards of elections to keep polls open for an additional hour. The litany of restrictions in this bill is possibly the most restrictive bill passed after the collapse of Section 5 protections due to Shelby County. And again, that is from North Carolina's legislature. Immediately, the Department of Justice, the North Carolina State Conference of the NAACP, the League of Women Voters, and the other affected groups and individuals sued the state. The Brennan Center for Justice submitted an amicus brief in support of the plaintiffs in the case NAACP versus McCrory. The U.S. Court of Appeals for the 4th Circuit struck down the law in July 2016, finding that it, and this is a quote, targeted African Americans with almost surgical precision. The court ruled that HB 589 violated Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act and the Constitution. On May 15, 2017, the Supreme Court denied North Carolina's petition for a writ of certiorari. That means they refused to hear the case because they agreed with the lower court's decision. So today, where are we at now in terms of voting rights? The history of voting rights is not over. Even today, the debate continues. One of the most heated debates is whether or not convicted felons who have served their time should be allowed to vote. Another controversy is whether non-citizens should have the right to vote. For example, in local school board elections, some people think non-citizens should be able to vote. In short, the debate about what it means to truly be a democratic society remains an ongoing, unfinished story. Thank you.